Most people think that being born into a rich family is a golden ticket. They imagine a life of yacht parties, designer clothes, and an endless summer of ease. For the first 18 years of my life, I was that person. My name is Alexander Sterling, and my father, Richard Sterling, was a titan of industry. He built a logistics empire from a single truck into a fleet of thousands. He was a self-made man, and he believed in one thing above all else: the iron code. He used to sit me down when I was just a boy and recite his mantra. "Alex," he'd say, his voice like gravel, "money is not for spending. Money is for winning. It is the scoreboard of life, and you don't get to coast on my points. You have to earn your own." Our house was a sprawling estate in the Hamptons, all glass and stark angles, as cold and precise as my father himself. My mother, Eleanor, was a ghost who floated through the halls, her life a cycle of charity galas and quiet desperation. She loved me, I knew that, but she was powerless against my father's iron will. He wasn't just the head of the household, he was the head of our universe. Our entire existence revolved around his moods, his business deals, and his obsessive need to control everything. I was sent to the best boarding schools, wore the best clothes, and had a trust fund that could buy a small country on paper. But my father made sure I never saw a penny of it. "It's a safety net," he'd say, "but I will cut the ropes if you ever become weak." I rebelled in the only way I could. I didn't get into drugs or become a delinquent. I became a dreamer. I fell in love with art, with the colors and chaos of creativity that were so opposite to my father's world of balance sheets and profit margins. I started spending my weekends in New York City, skipping the lacrosse games he had me enrolled in, to wander through the Met or hang out in the coffee shops of Greenwich Village. I was sneaking around like a criminal just to look at paintings. When I turned 18, my father sat me down in his study. The room smelled of leather and old money. "It's time for your real education, Alexander," he said, sliding a document across the polished mahogany desk. "You're going to start at the bottom. You'll work in the mailroom for a year, then the warehouse, then you'll go to night school for business. If you prove yourself, maybe one day you'll be worthy of this." He tapped the portfolio. I stared at him, my heart pounding. "Father, I want to go to art school. I want to be an artist." The silence in the room was deafening. He stared at me as if I'd just told him I was planning to join a circus. His face, usually a mask of stoicism, turned a shade of purple I'd never seen before. "Art." He whispered, the word dripping with disgust. "You want to waste your life scribbling pictures while I have built an empire for you. You are a Sterling. You are not some bohemian street performer." I had never stood up to him. No one did, but something inside me snapped that day. Maybe it was the years of repression, the constant feeling of being a puppet in his gilded show. "I don't want your empire," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "I don't want your money. I want to live my own life." Laughed, but it was a cold, hollow sound. "Without my money, you are nothing. You are a child playing dress-up in a world you don't understand. I'll give you a choice, Alex. You walk out that door, you walk out with nothing. No trust fund, no tuition, no car, no phone. You will be dead to me. You will be a nobody." I looked at the door, then back at him. I thought of my mother, who was probably listening from the hallway, too afraid to intervene. I thought of the cold, empty future he had laid out for me. And then I thought of the paintings, the freedom, the life I saw in vibrant colors. "Goodbye, Father," I said, and I walked out. The door of the Hamptons estate clicked shut behind me with a sound that felt like a gunshot. I was 18 years old, wearing a $1,000 suit, with $50 in my pocket and a cell phone that I knew he would cut off within the hour. I walked 2 miles to the train station, bought a ticket to the city with a chunk of my small cash, and sat on the train feeling a terrifying mix of liberation and pure, unadulterated fear. I was finally free, and I was completely alone. The first few weeks were a cruel joke. I checked into a cheap motel in Queens, thinking my $50 would last me a week. I was wrong. The motel was a nightmare of flickering neon lights and the constant sound of sirens. The sheets were stained and the smell of stale cigarette smoke was embedded in the walls. Still, I was determined. I applied for jobs everywhere. I walked into art galleries in Soho with my portfolio, the same one I had been working on for years, and was laughed out of the building. "Come back when you have a degree, kid," one gallery owner told me, "or at least a name for yourself." I applied to fast food chains, to retail stores, to anything that would take me. But without a permanent address, without a phone number that worked, I was invisible. I was a ghost. I remember the night I became truly homeless. I had spent my last $20 on a bus ticket to Brooklyn, chasing a rumor about a cheap room for rent in a warehouse. It was a scam. The address was an abandoned building. I stood on the street as the sun went down, watching the lights of the city flicker on, feeling the cold October wind cut through my now frayed jacket. I had no money. I had no friends. I had no one to call. I ended up in a 24-hour laundromat, huddled in a corner trying to sleep on a pile of hard plastic chairs. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the rhythmic thump of the dryers was the only sound. I had never felt so small. I thought about my bedroom back in the Hamptons, with its king-sized bed and the view of the ocean. I thought about the fancy dinners I used to take for granted, and I cried. I cried for the boy I had been, and for the man I was afraid I would never become. For the next 3 years, I fell into the abyss. I learned the brutal, grinding reality of life on the streets. I learned how to find the warm air vents outside office buildings to sleep by. I learned which fast food restaurants had managers who would give you a leftover burger if you showed up right before closing. I learned to spot the safe havens like the library, where you could sit for hours and read, pretending to be a normal person just to get out of the cold. The shame was the worst part. Every time I saw a man in a suit, I saw my father staring down at me, whispering, "I told you so." I stopped calling myself Alexander. It felt like a name for someone else, someone who had a future. I was just Alex now, a ghost in the shadows. I remember one particularly brutal winter. It had snowed heavily, and the city was a slushy, frozen nightmare. I was staying in a makeshift shelter under a bridge with a small group of others. There was an older man named Marcus who had been a carpenter before his life fell apart. There was a young woman named Chloe who had run away from an abusive home. We were a strange, broken family, huddled together for warmth. One night the police raided our spot. They were clearing out the homeless for some political event. We were chased out like rats. I ran, slipping on the ice, feeling my ankle twist. I limped through the snow for hours, my fingers numb, my face raw. I ended up in a subway station, sitting on a bench, shivering violently. I saw a young couple, probably college students, huddled together, laughing. The girl was wearing a heavy, expensive-looking coat. She looked at me, and I saw the flash of pity in her eyes before she quickly looked away. In that moment, I felt a hatred for her warmth and her comfort. And then I felt a deep, crushing self-loathing. I had become the thing people stepped over. I had become the cautionary tale. I spent a lot of time in the New York Public Library during those years. It was warm, it was quiet, and it was free. One afternoon, I was sitting in the art section, staring blankly at a book on Renaissance painters. I was trying to remember what it felt like to paint. I had sold my art supplies years ago for a hot meal. A librarian, a kind woman with silver hair named Mrs. Gable, noticed me. I was a regular, and she knew I wasn't a student. She came over, and instead of shooing me away like the security guards often did, she sat down. "You come here a lot," she said softly. "You always look at the art books. Do you paint?" I looked at her, and for some reason I told her the truth. I wanted to be an artist, but life got in the way. She didn't ask for details, she just nodded. "The library has free art classes in the basement every Tuesday. It's for underprivileged kids, but the teacher, Mr. Henderson, is a kind man. I could speak to him for you." I almost laughed. Underprivileged. That was a polite word for what I was. But something in me, a tiny ember I thought had died long ago, flickered. A few days later, I found myself in the basement of the library. It was a fluorescent-lit room with a horrible smell of floor wax, but it had easels and paints and brushes. There were about 10 children there, all from local schools. And there was Mr. Henderson, a man with a paint-smudged shirt and a gentle smile. He looked at me, a scruffy, dirty man with haunted eyes, and he didn't flinch. "Mrs. Gable tells me you have an eye for art," he said, handing me a brush. "Show me." I picked up the brush, and it felt foreign in my hand. My fingers were trembling, not from nerves, but from the malnutrition and cold that had become my constant companions. I looked at the blank canvas in front of me. I didn't know what to paint. I looked at my hand, at the cracked, dirty skin, and I started to paint. I painted my hand. I painted the veins like rivers, the dirt like a landscape, the broken nails like shattered glass. When I finished, I stepped back. It was raw, it was ugly, it was real. The children gathered around, their eyes wide. "Whoa," one little boy said. "That's so sad." But Mr. Henderson was silent. He stared at the painting for a long time. Then he looked at me, his eyes glistening. "This is not the work of a man who has given up," he said. "This is the work of a man who has been broken and is still standing. You are an artist, son. Never let anyone tell you otherwise." That was the moment the ember caught flame. It wasn't an overnight transformation. I didn't suddenly get a penthouse and a gallery showing, but I had a purpose again. I started going to the library classes every week. Mr. Henderson became my mentor. He gave me old paints and canvases that he could spare from his own studio. He introduced me to a social worker who helped me get into a shelter, a real shelter, not a bridge. It wasn't luxury. It was a bunk bed in a room with 30 other men. There were curfews and rules and a constant undercurrent of anxiety, but it had a shower and it had a hot meal. And most importantly, it had an address. With an address, I could get a job. I started working at a diner near the library. It was a greasy spoon, the kind of place where the coffee was always stale and the floor was always sticky. But I scrubbed dishes and I bussed tables and I earned just enough to keep my head above water. I lived a double life. By day I was a dishwasher, a nobody. But by night I was an artist. I would paint in the tiny corner of the shelter using my bunk as a makeshift studio. The other men thought I was crazy, painting when I could be sleeping, but they let me be. I saved every penny. I didn't buy new clothes. I didn't go out. I just painted and worked. After a year, I had a small body of work. It was a collection of portraits of the people I had met on the streets, Marcus with his gentle eyes and broken hands, Chloe with her defiant stare, the sleeping man on the subway. They weren't just paintings of homeless people. They were paintings of humanity. They were paintings of survival. I finally gathered the courage to approach a small, independent gallery in the East Village. The owner was a cynical man in his 50s named Vincent. He looked at my paintings with a skeptical eye. "These are interesting," he said, running his finger over the canvas. "Depressing but interesting. Who are you? I've never heard of you." I told him my story. I told him I was a dishwasher, a former rich kid, a homeless man. I told him everything. He stared at me for a long moment. "A painter with a story," he said. "That's rare. Most artists have no story, just technique. You have a real story. This pain is real. I'll give you a small show in the back room, 3 nights. If you sell anything, I take 40%. If you don't, you can at least say you had a show." I wanted to hug him, but I just shook his hand, my own trembling again. I spent weeks preparing for that show. I convinced the owner of the diner to let me take the days off. I burned my fingers trying to make sure the frames were perfect. I didn't have the money for fancy promotional materials, so I just wrote the address on slips of paper and handed them out to anyone who would take them. The night of the opening arrived and I was terrified. The back room of the gallery was tiny, barely enough space for my 10 paintings. I stood there, my heart pounding, waiting. The first night was a disaster. 3 people came in and 2 of them were Vincent's friends who probably came just for the free wine. They barely looked at the paintings. I stood in the corner, invisible, feeling the familiar sting of failure. I went back to the shelter that night and stared at the ceiling, wondering if it was all for nothing. But the second night, something happened. Mrs. Gable, the librarian, showed up. She had brought a friend. They stood in front of the painting of my hand and talked for a long time. Then Mr. Henderson arrived, his face beaming with pride. "You did it, Alex," he said. "You have a show." And then on the 3rd night I saw her, my mother, Eleanor Sterling. I almost didn't recognize her. She looked older, thinner, more fragile. She was wearing a simple dress, nothing like the designer gowns I remembered. She was trying not to be seen, but I spotted her immediately. She walked slowly around the room, looking at each painting. When she got to a portrait I had done of my father, a depiction of him as a king on a crumbling throne, she stopped. She stood there for a long time. Then she turned to look at me. She walked over, her eyes filled with tears. "Alex," she whispered, reaching out to touch my face. "My beautiful boy, I looked for you. For years I looked for you. But your father, he told me you had gone to Europe. He said you were fine, just living your life." I was so afraid, but I believed him. I was so weak. She was crying openly now. I had to find you. I hired a private investigator. It took him months. I never stopped looking. I'm so sorry I failed you. I was so scared of him I let you disappear. I felt a cold rage building in my chest. My father had lied to cover up his cruelty, to protect his perfect image. But when I looked into my mother's eyes, I saw the same brokenness I had seen in the faces of the people I painted. She wasn't the villain, she was another victim. I hugged her, the first real hug I had received in years. "It's okay, Mom," I said, my voice cracking. "You're here now, that's all that matters." She stayed for the rest of the night, and she bought a painting, the one of my hand. "It's my favorite," she said, "because it's yours." That night I sold 2 more paintings. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. It was validation. Over the next few years, things began to change. The art world is a strange, fickle beast. My work started to get noticed. A local art critic who happened to come to the gallery for another show stumbled upon my work and wrote a small review. "A raw, powerful voice from the underbelly of New York," he called me. The gallery shows became bigger. The prices went up. I was no longer a dishwasher. I was a rising star in the underground art scene. I moved out of the shelter and into a tiny studio apartment. It had a skylight and enough room for a real easel. I was still poor by most standards, but I was no longer homeless. I had a roof, I had a purpose, and I had hope, but the shadow of my father still hung over me. My mother had eventually divorced him. She walked away with a comfortable settlement, enough to live on modestly. She started a small art therapy foundation for at-risk youth, using her own story and mine to guide her. She had become the person she was always meant to be, not just a trophy wife, but a woman with a mission. My father, on the other hand, had taken a hit. The scandal of the divorce was nothing compared to the whispers that his son had been homeless. He was a man obsessed with image, and it was the deepest wound he could ever suffer. But he was still a billionaire. He was still the king of his castle. And I was still his son, the prodigal son who had come back from the dead. Media caught wind of my story. "Billionaire's son from the streets to the gallery." It was a headline that sold papers. I was suddenly in high demand. Everyone wanted to know what it was like to be a prince who had become a pauper. I hated it. They didn't want to see the art, they wanted to see the soap opera. That's when my father reached out. It was a message delivered through a lawyer. He wanted to see me. He wanted to reconcile. I was in my studio, covered in paint, when I got the letter. I felt nothing but cold emptiness. I thought about the 5 years I had spent on the streets. I thought about the nights I almost froze to death. I thought about the hunger and the shame. And I thought about his iron code. He had built an empire on the backs of others, and he had thrown me away like garbage when I refused to be part of it. I decided to go. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to see the look on his face. Maybe I wanted the satisfaction of rejecting him. Maybe I just wanted closure. I arrived at his office in the Sterling Tower, the tallest building in the city. I was wearing a simple suit I had bought myself, nothing designer, but it was mine. The secretary didn't recognize me. She asked for my name, and when I said Alexander Sterling, her eyes went wide. I walked into his office. It was just as I remembered it, all cold, expensive glass and pretentious art. There he was, my father, sitting behind his enormous desk. He looked older. The years had been unkind. The imperial aura was gone, replaced by a tired, desperate-looking old man. He stood up, and for the first time in my life I saw something like fear in his eyes. "Alex," he said. "Son, you look, well." I didn't sit down. "You're looking old, father," I said flatly. He flinched. "Alex, I need to say something. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. I was trying to teach you a lesson. I thought if I cut you off, you would come crawling back. I thought I could break your stubbornness. I was wrong. I was a fool." He took a deep breath. "I want to bring you back into the fold. I want to give you your place in the company. You are my only son. This empire is yours by right. I'll make you CEO within the next 3 years. You can have your trust fund back plus interest. I have a lot of money, Alex. I can give you everything you ever wanted. Just say you'll come back. Just say you forgive me." I looked at him. I looked at his expensive suit, his fancy office, his desperate eyes, and I saw him for what he truly was, a pathetic, lonely man who had measured his worth by his net worth and had come up empty. He hadn't found me to apologize. He had found me because he needed me. He was getting old,